Okay, well, welcome to the Psychedelic State. This is a seminar series hosted by myself and the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, focusing on bringing the research renaissance in psychedelics to the public, with an emphasis on practical engagement with these compounds, because we all know full well that you're all going to do them. And in light of a harm reduction perspective, we want to make sure that while we don't condone the engagement in illegal activities, knowing that these things are going to happen anyways, we want to arm you with the information possible to make sure that you reduce the harms and maximize the benefits that are a part of the use of different drugs, in this case, psychedelic drugs. So, a bit about myself. My name's Dan. I'm a student here at the University of Toronto. I am taking cognitive science and philosophy. So I like to research what I call cognitive optimization. That is, making sure that well-being is achieved and that your brain is working as good as it can. So when it comes to microdosing, there's a lot of information out there on the internet, a lot of misinformation. You've probably all seen articles, claiming that LSD can definitely 100% make you a millionaire, or personal reports of how DMT made Silicon Valley entrepreneurs shoot up to having billions of dollars. And that's all very entertaining and all, but they can't cause you to have a good life. However, they definitely can facilitate the having of a good life. But as with all of the other problems in living, it takes a lot of work on your end to make sure that that happens. And so what I want to do is to try to sort of demystify the phenomena of psychedelics, especially microdosing, in this seminar, and in so doing, give you all the intellectual tools to be able to integrate them into your lives, if you so choose, in a way that helps you get the most out of it. Now, one of the interesting things about microdosing is that it's not precisely like other kinds of drugs that you can take for cognitive enhancing purposes. Some people around exam time will, resort to stimulants and so on to try to get that extra kick and fit in their cramming. But with psychedelics, they actually, I should say possibly, because the research at this state warrants using more or less specific language, but it is very likely the case that psychedelics can actually sort of tune up your neural systems in general to give you effects not only during the time that you're using psychedelics, but after them as well. So the methodology that I'm going to be employing here is what I call a that but less analysis. There are absolutely no studies that are experimental and controlled on psychedelics. We have lots of self-reports online, but there's been nothing actually sort of minimizing interfering variables in the results that we get. And so what we do have to draw upon are a bunch of moderate to high dose experimental studies. And as the fundamental mechanisms of substances do not change, I will just be considering microdosing to be doing that, but less. And I'm not sure if you're prepared for it, but I'm also going to give you a bit of a crash course in cognitive science, because psychedelics, we refer to the roots of what the name means. We have the word psyche and delos coming into psychedelic. Psyche meaning mind, and delos meaning to manifest. So what psychedelics are mind manifesting agents. And interestingly, they do that so literally that it also is true in the objective scientific sense. They can perturb the neural system in such a way that we can sort of reveal and manifest its function. And so I hope to make this seminar a little bit psychedelic, and also allowing it to teach you a little bit about yourself and what's going on up here. So there are a few other terms that people like to use when they're talking about psychedelics. I often go with this one because it is the most accurate and generalizable. And it also gets at something that I like to emphasize in the seminar a lot, that the psychedelic state is not so much just psychedelic drugs, but it is a state that you can partake of in other ways, and has, in fact, likely been what mystical and magical practices throughout the ages have been trying to initiate within one's mind. All of the stuff that makes psychedelic experiences happen are already within the neural substrate, so psychedelic experiences are as much a function of yourself as they are of the chemicals. And so we need to not ignore the crucial nature of the individual in producing these types of experiences. So hallucinogen is another common name used for psychedelics. That is things that generate hallucinations. However, particularly say with mushrooms, that's actually not a necessary result of using mushrooms. You don't always have hallucinations. It's much more emotional, and you can have a full trip that is immensely deeply profound without having any hallucinations whatsoever. Another name that I have heard that I rather like is oneirogens, which means to generate dreams. So that is a name that applies to psychedelics in using them in a certain way. And another category that we can count here is the category of nootropics, which is, things that enhance cognitive functioning. So that's how we're going to be talking about psychedelics today, as a nootropic. In using them in microdosing, we are sort of co-opting some of their functions to use them for that purpose. So what we're going to talk about first is a little bit about dosing. How do you microdose? Believe it or not, that's actually the least interesting part of microdosing, and it's the easiest thing to sort of get acquainted with. So we're going to brush through that fairly quickly. And then we're going to talk about specifically what sorts of effects you can get out of microdosing. Then we're going to talk about the brain and give you a bit of a background on that, so that I can then tell you, based on the research that we have, precisely how microdosing can initiate the sorts of changes that I'm going to be claiming that they do. And yeah, I have a bonus thing that I might talk about at the end, but we'll see if I have time. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about are specifically tryptamine psychedelics. That's sort of my specialty when it comes to reading into this subject. I've read a whole bunch of literature on, for example, psilocybin and LSD. That is where the research exists right now. Ayahuasca and DMT count as well. When I was reviewing the event page before I came, I noticed a lot of people were asking about different types of research chemicals. For example, like 1P LSD and 4-ACO DMT. There were a few that people had mentioned that I hadn't heard of yet, which is precisely one of the problems with using novel research chemicals, is that there's really not any research done with that. So in order to make this an ethically grounded seminar, we're going to focus on what there is research into, and then I suggest that if you do want to explore anything else, that you make use of resources such as Erowid.com, Blue Light. It's a forum where drug users can collate their information and to help each other out in that domain. Make sure that you are drawing upon these information and don't do anything without first looking into it. So with dosing, usually when you're going about it, you want to make sure that you start off very conservatively. So for psilocybin, about 0.2 grams is where you want to start at. The goal is to make the doses sub-perceptual, meaning that they are not noticeable directly, they are not perceptible to your explicit experience of consciousness. So for psilocybin, like I said, that's about 0.2 dried grams, and for LSD, that's about 10 micrograms. Now, the doses are very much weight dependent, so if you weigh less, then if you feel like you want to start with less, absolutely do that. If you weigh a little bit more and you don't notice anything from a dose that small, then by all means increase. And so my personal recommendation would be that you stick with psilocybin when you're beginning, because you can always make sure that a mushroom is a mushroom. When you're getting LSD or some other sort of blotter, you can't ever really be 100% sure that there isn't some other psychedelic on there. Some of them are fine, but then there are some like the N-Bone series, which can actually be toxic for you, and usually last about twice as long as LSD. So, especially if you're like prone to anxiety or something and you don't really take to stimulants, it might be a good idea to sort of stay away from that being a risk in general, which is another reason why I didn't want to get too much into novel psychoactive substances, because there is that risk with powders and liquids and such that is always present. However, at the end, if you do have questions about anything, then I will open up the floor to those subjects. So what are the differences between, say, psilocybin and LSD? I mean, they're both tryptamines, which mean they both are synthesized from tryptophan, which is also the amino acid precursor to serotonin. So as a result, they fit into the serotonin receptors in your brain, predominantly the 5-HT2A receptors and the 5-HT1A receptors, and we'll talk a little bit about the specific function of those in a bit. Now, LSD, all things considered, if this were a perfect world and you could safely procure these things, would in fact be the optimal one, I would think, because it has more of a direct action on your dopaminergic system, which is responsible for your motivation, your sense of reward, helping you pursue goals, and so on. So it actually keeps you much clearer and sharper than, say, psilocybin does. At very low doses, it's sort of a negligible difference, but if you really are looking for what is the best, then LSD probably, because of that, would be a little bit better. There is also one study that shows that psilocybin can slightly impair your attention in the domain of filtering out distractions. So if you happen to take a bit too much, then that can be a problem. However, that problem results from something that actually makes it good for therapeutic purposes. But I think that I would expect you wouldn't get that effect really at all because of the dopaminergic stimulation of LSD. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, you really sped by. You said 0.2 grams for psilocybin. How many micrograms for LSD to start?
10. Yes. Right.
That's what I had my head.
Yeah. I can talk very quickly, so if you need me to reiterate anything.
So 10 micrograms, how much is that on a standard hit?
About an eighth of a tab usually. Okay. Yeah, but it depends, because you can put any amount on there. You should definitely check with your source. Or if you can get liquid LSD, then you have more.
And if someone's heavier, they would probably increase that to maybe 15 micrograms or 20 micrograms.
Yeah.
If they're like over 200 pounds, let's say.
Yeah, if you're over 200 pounds, you probably want to bump it up a little bit. But when it comes to this, you definitely want to start slow. And if you are new at this, precisely because it is almost impossible to notice any of the cognitive differences when you haven't ever had any access to psychedelics previously, I do recommend don't take more than one dose per day until you've sort of gotten used to it and are familiar with the effects. Yes?
I've got the document up, and you mentioned 4 ACO.
Yep.
What percentage of that is microdose?
Yeah, so that's very similar to LSD. I think it would still be measured in micrograms, about 10 or so. But yeah, I didn't double check that before I came, just because I'm sort of leaving the novel psychoactive substances to the side. That information is very accessible on aerobic.com, for example. But yeah, 4-ACO-DMT, of all of the research chemicals, is one that is very interesting because it just breaks down into your body into psilocin, which is what psilocybin breaks down into anyways, so it technically should be about the same as mushrooms in the qualities of it. Yeah, any other questions?
Obviously, Tim Leary covered some of this research in the 60s psilocybin. Does that factor into what you're doing here today?
I am not going to be talking about anything from the 50s or 60s. There has been 50 years of neuroscientific research. We do not need to touch any of that. And also, Leary has been sort of notorious for fudging some of his results. He has been caught for falsifying some of those. There was one especially where he was doing the effects of psychedelics on recidivism in prisoners. None of those results, as he claimed, were what they were.
The thing about Leary is, before he got into psychedelics, he was a well-respected psychologist at Yale, and I think I think it's maybe fair to say he maybe took the LSD a little too much to heart. But I think also maybe the earlier portions where he's doing mushrooms and things like that. So you don't think there's any validity to what started kind of the first modern psychedelic?
I think there's validity to it. I don't think that it's really necessary, right? For example, I can just restrict myself to the research from the last 5 years and give you probably a more accurate take on these things than had I included that. Yeah, because in the last 20 years or so, there's been like literally hundreds of papers put out. When people call it the psychedelic renaissance, they're not taking that lightly at all, and the frequency with which papers are coming out is much, much greater. And then the conclusions that the writers are coming to are also much more accurate just because the fields of neuroscience and psychology themselves have been updated. So, I think that stuff is valid if I was, for example, giving a history of psychedelic research, but because I'm trying to stick mostly to like what is accurate and true, I'm going to be just sort of restricting the scope of this, talking about the facts of the recent scientific research.
Okay. One more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any info on Dr. Jim Fadiman? He mentioned one method of a 10-week cycle where the person does a microdose every 4th day in 10 weeks.
Yes. Yeah, this is precisely what I was going to address next.
Okay.
So,
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. That's good. You're right on the ball. So if you look on like online guides, usually you will see the once every 3-day regimen being recommended. So what they recommend is that you microdose one day, wait 2 days, microdose the next day, wait 2 days, so on. Now, that is often quoted as being from the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, but James Fadiman himself actually does not recommend that. That is from a self-report by a guy, pseudonym Chris, who gave his own experiences and his own opinion on how to be doing that. Now, this is an anonymous survey. We don't have any idea what this individual's background or qualifications are in mind sciences, and so I think that is a great method if you are new to psychedelics, just so you can clearly differentiate between how your mind is when you are microdosing and when it's not. So it's really good as like a learning tool to sort of like get yourself up in there. But Fadiman himself, at the end of the chapter on subperceptual doses, quotes a chemist friend of his who he asked about that. And his friend said that at such low doses, you're probably not really going to experience any of the habituation effect. With larger doses, you can get very used to it very quickly. So if you do large doses of psychedelics, say 3 days in a row, by the 3rd or 4th day, you'll either have to take quite a lot more or you won't really feel anything at all. And so, Fadiman's speculation was that perhaps that was why that individual had recommended doing it once every 3 days. But yeah, the chemist he consulted said, it's not really necessary. We don't have any testing on that, of course, but he does say that there's probably nothing wrong with dosing every day, at least for short periods of time.
Yeah, because I was reading every 4th day, actually, 4th or 5th day.
Right. Yeah, all of that at this point is speculation, just because there isn't any rigorous data on that.
Oh, okay, that's what it was.
Yeah, so if that works for you, then that's totally fine. Of course, you'll have to sort of do some exploration to sort of see what works best for you. But yeah, the reason that I'm going to go into some of the brain stuff here is because knowing what psychedelics do, you can sort of time your dosing better, because effective microdosing is more a matter of timing. So if you know that, hey, it's sort of boosting these subsystems, and I really need to sort of be insightful or creative at this particular time, or maybe you have to do a project and you procrastinated and now you only have 3 days to do it, then it's totally fine to just take those 3 days and microdose and get that thing done. My recommendation on that, though, would be that at around 5 to 7 days, probably take a day or two off, just because we don't really know if there are any actual depletion effects or so on from persistent dosing of that nature. And like I mentioned as well, the idea here is to sort of give you a general cognitive boost, not to sort of have to rely on this to be creative, because you don't even need to do that. All right, I think that I covered everything on that. Okay, so we'll move on to what the effects are. So I included the list in the reference document, which was emailed out to anybody who purchased tickets as of last night. But if you have not seen the reference document yet, then I posted it on the Facebook group. And if anybody hasn't got that, I can make that available at the end of the seminar. I can set up a quick link for downloading that. Okay, so potential benefits of microdosing. All right, so what can they do for you? Well, the tryptamine psychedelics, they can bias your emotional processing towards positive mood states and away from negative mood states. They can shift processing dominance from lower order automatic response dispositions and shift it up into higher order rational cognitive explicit control. We'll talk about that in a dual processing theory framework, which is prominent in psychology at the moment. It can broaden your thinking style, which is one of the reasons that it can increase your creativity and insightfulness. It can increase attentional capacity, although like I said, at higher doses, it can interfere with your capacity to sort of filter out irrelevant stimuli from the environment, whether that be your internal environment or the external environment. So, if you want to really account for that, you can make sure to structure your environment so that you stay on task and don't get distracted by something that seems really novel and exciting all of a sudden, because most things will. And there is one caution. Some people, if they are prone to negative mood states, say, you have chronic manic depression or major depressive disorder or something, you might actually notice that because of this, that you might become more aware of the negative mood state that you're in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Often people just like try to push that away and ignore it, and then it just kind of ruins the whole thing. But the characteristics of the psychedelic state are such that that is the optimal time to be directing your attention to that negative material to resolve it. So, if you find that that does happen to you, you might just need to set aside some time for introspection, look into yourself a little bit, and that is much better than trying to ignore it, because like I said, you will not as well be able to ignore those kinds of things. So one of the other potential benefits is that they can increase the ability for insight experiences. You have an enhanced ability to connect with others, enhanced creativity, and interestingly, it also reduces learned constraints on your neural circuits and thereby enables you to retrain and relearn neural circuits in your brain. Okay, so we're going to take a minor detour into some brain stuff, and then I will tell you precisely why all of that stuff is happening. So, what is the brain? The brain, it is an organ. It is not the thing that you identify with as the entire personality of yourself. And so it doesn't really have access to the information that you as an individual thinking cognitive agent have. One of the sort of models that brains are understood to operate on is a bioeconomic model. So what that means is it's a biological organism, and economic, it has a set amount of resources that it has to distribute, and usually, sort of the higher order, more abstract processing requires much greater metabolic effort. So researcher Keith Stanovich, who is a psychologist at the University of Toronto, he refers to human beings as being cognitive misers as the default, meaning that if we really don't have to exert cognitive energy, then the brain is going to do everything it can to not do that at all. So sometimes you do need a little bit of a boost or a kick to get you sort of shifted up into those higher order areas, which psychedelics very literally do. And as a result of this, a lot of cognitive processing is heuristic, meaning it runs on sort of shortcuts, internalized, basically just shortcuts of processing. You have automatic intuitions, and those sort of like collapse different forms of reasoning. And there's a lot of really interesting research on some of the sort of deficits in rationality that come with that. One of the examples that Stanovich usually uses in his experiments is, so say I have a baseball bat and a baseball, and the ball is 10 cents. How does this one go? Yeah, oh no, I'm forgetting. Do you remember precisely the wording of the?
Yeah, it's one of them. Dollar and one of them. You're trying to figure out.
No, I know that part.
The price of the baseball.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's something like this. It's something like
110, and then
Yeah, I was hoping that you wouldn't give the answer away first. But thanks. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, basically, so the problem is that
that is $1.05 and the baseball's 5 cents.
Yeah, it's like the baseball is 5 cents, and then if the bat is $1 more than the baseball, then how much is the baseball bat? And then people will often put that it's $1. And that's like the first immediate intuition that comes up. But in fact, the correct answer is that it is $1.05, because in order to equal $1.10, which is given in the problem, it has to be that. But people's immediate judgments do not precisely accord with standards of rationality. So the way that Stanovich puts the mind is that it runs on 3 distinct but interrelated levels of processing. So you have the autonomous level of the mind, the algorithmic level of the mind, and the reflective level of the mind. So the autonomous level is like your limbic system, all of this sort of lower order stuff. You've probably heard of the reptilian brain before, very much an extension of that kind of theory. And it also is the fact that if you go, sort of closer down into the cortical and brain hierarchy, closer to the brain stem, all of that stuff down there is evolutionarily earlier, and is much more automatic and not quite as open to higher order interference and change, which is probably good, because if you could regulate your heartbeat or something with higher order thought, that could be a mess. So At the mid-level, you sort of get your algorithmic intuitions, your sort of shortcuts in processing and so on. Then you have your reflective mind, which is the most effortful and deliberate level of processing. And that's all of the things that you can sort of hold ready in your explicit consciousness and work on with your mind. So that is usually put in terms of a dual process theory. So system one is your automatic intuitive processing. It includes lower areas of the brain, such as the thalamus, parts of the cingulate cortex, the brainstem, the hippocampus, and so on. You don't really have a lot of control over system one. It sort of does its processing automatically on its own before you're even aware of what comes into your mind. System two, on the other hand, is much slower. It's a more rational and deliberate system. And as such, these are often called the hot system and the cold system. This one is like, really warm and works really fast. The other one, not so much. It takes much more cognitive energy and effort, and it's much slower in its operation. So the predominant area of system two is the neocortex, especially the prefrontal cortex. That's where a lot of your, human-related processing is going on. Your reasoning, your willful action, that kind of stuff. And now, this is an abstraction, of course, so there is some overlap and interplay between these two. They're not discrete, separate systems. They do have a lot of interrelation, and you can definitely use each of these to do different sorts of things. For example, there is a paper recently called Development of a New Intuition Scale. The researcher who wrote that, the primary researcher, is Pretz. And they outline at least three different kinds of intuition. There's effective and affective intuition, meaning sort of your felt sense of how things are, inferential intuition, and holistic intuition. Holistic intuition is like your general run-of-the-mill immediate impressions of things. Inferential intuition is thoughts or thought patterns that had previously had to have been rational, explicit, but that you later internalized to become automatic and deliberate. So stuff that starts out in system two can actually be sort of passed over on into system one. For example, say you play guitar or piano and then you become really good at improvisation. That is an offsetting of the cognitive load from first having to deliberately learn how to do your scales slowly and so on, into being able to automatically do them on the fly.
So what are the three types again? Inferential, holistic, and
affective. Yeah. Okay, so now what else is the brain? So the brain is a dynamical system. Dynamical systems theory has been used to model the brain and how the neural activity plays out. A dynamical system is really just a system that moves a lot and has a lot of changing aspects. One of the key findings in dynamical systems we can trace back to sort of the 19th century. The reason that we had to develop this is because anything that has more than three elements in the system is very, very difficult to sort of predict the trajectory of its behavior. So there's a problem called the three-body problem, which was worked on by Henry Poincaré in the 19th century, and what he found was that using just regular Newtonian physics, it was very, very difficult to predict the outcome of the system just using strict linear Newtonian physics alone. And so one of the solutions to that is that if you wanted to predict the outcome of a system that has at least three elements or more, then you need to add in time steps, which is where we get our differential equations. And so the time step can be, an arbitrary variable, 1 second, 1 minute. What you have to do is to allow the system to go through the time steps, recalculate from there, let it go through another time step, recalculate from there, so on. Then you can sort of pull an idea out of the regularity of the motions of the complex system. So that definitely applies to brains because there are like more connections in the brain than there are like objects in the universe. So it is a very, very complex system. And one of the important findings that comes from dynamical systems is the notion of an attractor. And your brain has tons of attractors in them, some of which are very important, especially to psychedelic researchers. One of them is referred to a lot. So what is an attractor? All right. So an attractor exists within a phase space. And let's just say, we'll just draw a very simple graph here. And so a phase space is an abstract representation of all of the states that the system could possibly be in. So any point in the system is like one state that the set of objects could be in. And as you have the system actually interact, it will develop a regularity within the system known as an attractor, which is where the system will tend towards and continue to tend towards. So even though at all times there are a lot of places that the system could possibly be in, it becomes constrained and restricted by its own activity to only ever being within some smaller subset of all possible states. So say we get like an attractor developing here, the continual momentum of the attractor will make sure that the system does not deviate too much from this space. So this is interesting also in artificial intelligence research, because this is also something that applies to your brain dynamics as well, just simply because there are so many more possible states for any system to be in than it is at any given time. It's very likely that the system will settle into what is called a spurious attractor state, which is just a suboptimal attractor state. So there are a few optimal solutions with any phase space for the problem that that system is trying to confront, but there are many more sort of suboptimal spaces that it will end up in, and then once you have a attractor develop, because it does literally attract the activity towards itself, it's very difficult to sort of break out of that into novel states. Now what happens in the development of artificial neural networks is that you can just sort of back the system up a few of its time steps and restart it and hope that it settles into one of its more optimal solution spaces. You can't really take the brain back in time though, so that's not a very sustainable method for doing that. Now, there was a paper published in 2015 called Neural Coordination Can Be Enhanced by Occasional Interruption of Normal Firing Patterns, a self-optimizing spiking neural network model. And what they found was that what you can do instead is you can just restart the system from a set of random conditions, and that will allow the system to explore all of its possible states and to settle into a more optimal state. Those researchers then went on to say that, hey, that's actually probably what psychedelics are doing to your brain, because they do increase the amount of chaos or uncertainty within the neural system. Usually in the waking state, your neural activity is very constrained and sort of governed by higher order networks, such as the default mode network, which we'll get into in a second. And so as a result, psychedelics can have an optimizing effect on your neural networks at any dose really, but especially at high doses, because they can sort of break you out of self-reinforcing attractor states that sort of prevent you from being able to process information in different ways. And that can, of course, be a problem if your general way of processing is very maladaptive, say as in depression or anxiety, and causes you to suffer frequently.
Two questions. I was just wondering, first of all, is the idea that you're basically resetting your brain so it's no longer stuck in these patterns of habituation?
Yeah, it definitely, it doesn't necessarily have that effect, because obviously with plasticity, the way that your networks are represented in your brain are physiologically grounded, so there is always a memory of them. You can't do a complete reset. But in being able to explore spaces that your networks are otherwise constraining themselves from exploring, you can thereby develop new networks and new behaviors and so on.
And how would this play into, I guess, chaos theory? Does that?
Oh, yeah, that's the same.
Okay.
Yeah, you can, this dynamical systems complexity theory stuff, it all bridges and branches right in there.
So it's all very predictable,
do you mean modelable?
Yes.
Yeah, because being chaotic is intrinsically unpredictable.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, we definitely have lots of mathematical models to sort of throw at these problems. So I'll make this a little bit more concrete in terms of human development, because I know I've been a little bit abstract at the moment, and then I'll ask for if anybody needs clarification on these subjects. So, for example, we have the default mode network, which is of particular interest to researchers in the psychedelic science movement. And the reason being, psychedelics seem to basically rest in the nodes of the default mode network and kind of shut it off and reduce its activity. So the default mode network, this is my very poorly drawn brain, if you have been wondering what this is. So this is the cerebellum for reference. This is the frontal cortex, and this is your occipital lobe, and so on, fill in the spaces. So parts of the default mode network we have are like the medial prefrontal cortex. There's a bit of the posterior cingulate cortex, which is back here. The cingulate cortex is this organ that sort of like runs right underneath your neocortex here. So the back region is a key connecting node. There's also a small connecting node in the hippocampus, and then the angular gyrus, which is like somewhere up here. So you have this like interesting sort of triangulated network state that is maintaining a readiness during waking consciousness to respond to any of the problems of the day. Referred to as being the neurobiological substrate of the ego by Robin Carhart Harris, who is the one doing the brain imaging research with psilocybin at the Imperial College of London. His reason being is that this network is involved in precisely all of the things that we would say the ego is involved in, namely having a conception of self, having a capacity to think of the future, to think of the past, rumination, and so on. And this network is very highly connected in depression, anxiety, a number of other conditions. So when this network is too rigidly connected, that is a key marker of mental illness. Because what you actually need is, this is just sort of like a resting state. It's a resting state network. There's about 11 resting state networks that exist within the brain, and this is the one that sort of coordinates your more holistic self-related processing. And so what needs to happen is, this is usually inversely correlated with task-positive networks, meaning when this is active, your task-positive networks are not active, and vice versa. So your task-positive networks are basically just everything else, because there's a lot of tasks that we need to be doing, and so that is a very large subset of things. And what you get happening is, when you're at rest, this network is connected, and when you need to engage in the world, it sort of breaks out, differentiates into a bunch of chaotic signals, and then it will go through phases of differentiation and integration in the areas that are needed for solving the problems at hand. So say you need to recall a memory or something, there's a connection here that means that you can readily access your memory, but in the actual act of doing that, you'll sort of have a bit of differentiation of it. The signal will get sent down more solidly into the hippocampus, and then when you are maintaining the memory, for example, you might see more activity in the prefrontal cortex as it sort of snaps into that area to allow you to maintain it within your working memory to consciously refer to it. So this network also, it's completely absent at birth. It's developmental. So it follows precisely this sort of pattern that I was referring to with dynamical systems and phase spaces. The brain of a child is very, very chaotic. There's lots of activity and very little regularity in it. It's very chaotic. And as a child develops, the brain will explore all of the possible states that it could, and then there will be a learning response which will select the networks that are most adequately solve the problems of life. So, for example, perception and so on. Perception is really cool. That starts very, very early. For vision, for example, even when a child is still in the womb, you get rapid eye movement, sleep-like motions with the eyes. What the child is actually doing is it's helping to differentiate which of the neurons in the occipital cortex are required for vision by exploring all possible states that the visual organs that those neurons are connected to can explore. And then there will be a pruning phase where all of the networks that it doesn't need and all of the neurons that it doesn't need will be sort of culled and will die off. And what you'll have left is just what is necessary for being able to cover all of the spaces that the eyes could possibly be in. And same with the default mode network. you have lots of irregularity in the system. As you develop a personality and a character, this network will sort of start to emerge around like 2-3 years old. It becomes more and more defined up until you're about in your 20s.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So given that there's, I guess, a physical thing happening there in the brain, right? Would you say then that during the formative years that, you know, if a child was growing up in an abusive situation, something like that, that's like literally imprinting on the brain?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Just, yes. And so, yeah, so the question was, like, if you are growing up in an abusive environment or something, are these networks going to develop to reflect that environment? And absolutely, yeah. Depression has causes, you know, it's not only, and I think probably not even very often is it just a random biological thing that you couldn't control. There's often, even if you can't pinpoint it, some reason developmentally as to why that is the case. Lars, thank you so much. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Anything they want me to clarify? Okay, you're excited.
You mentioned that when you're asking for the world, that it can kind of bring up that network. So
Yeah.
like that would be beneficial on some level. You said it would like coordinate some of the sort of let's say the neural firings or whatever patterns that are going on in the brain. So wouldn't that also be like kind of helpful on some level? Like, you know, just kind of like try to be more, I don't know, not extroverted, but maybe sort of extrinsically oriented.
Yeah, totally. So that bridges perfectly into the next point that I was going to make, which is about flow states. So the question was, if your brain, when you are interacting with the world, is like snapping into phases of like differentiation and then reorganizing in the areas where those functions are needed, does being able to do that make you sort of more extrinsically oriented towards the world beyond yourself? And yeah, totally. That's why it's like, if you're depressed, it's really difficult to like find yourself to even get motivated out of bed in the morning. And that's why there's also greater cognitive deficits. Like in depression, it's also much more difficult to recall memories in general. It's a very constrained sort of mode of thinking. And so flow states are precisely the opposite of that. Let me see if I can get this name right. The researcher that is sort of the pioneer in this field, his name is Csikszentmihalyi. Is that? Okay, so it's like a silent L.
Csikszentmihalyi. It's actually, he writes it with those words. Apparently, he wrote it with those words to a talk at the rate he was at. He wrote Csikszentmihalyi. That's how you say it. Apparently.
That's hilarious. That's great.
Why don't you write it down for us?
Oh, I will. So often the research on flow states is done in the domain of like sports and music composition and performance. So a flow state precisely is when you are able to, as the task requires, have that massive like sort of recoordination on the fly of neural activity. So what you're going to end up getting is that you're going to feel really in the zone. That's what a flow state is. It's being in the zone when you're solving everything that you need to solve precisely at the right time, and that actually correlates to an ideal timing in the brain of everything sort of snapping into order precisely when it needs to. And yeah, so John Vervaeke, who is a lecturer here at the University of Toronto, he mentions that the more you experience flow states in your life, the more likely you are to have a positive and meaningful life. Because this network, when it dominates your processing, sort of constrains you and constricts you from being able to break into the cognitive mode that is required in order to be engaging in tasks. It kind of sort of instantiates itself as a general problem solver, but of course it's only a restricted subset of the brain, and you can't really solve all of your problems by ruminating about how bad you're already doing at them. And so the things that this thing does are not always precisely optimal for getting positive feedback in the world and doing well in whatever you're trying to do. And so one of the things that psychedelics are going to do is they're going to sort of loosen up the constraints on your neural networks such that you can actually more effectively enter into a flow state. Does anybody have any questions?
Can you repeat that last thing you said just so it sinks in?
Yeah, so psychedelics are actually going to loosen the constraints in your cognition such that it becomes easier to enter into a flow state.
What was the brain circuit again? The prefrontal and what was here in the back?
Oh, the posterior cingulate cortex?
Posterior cingulate cortex and what else? What is the
yeah, okay, so we have medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus up here. There's a small connection to the hippocampus. And there's a whole bunch of, like, these are just like the main connecting nodes of this. The default mode network is actually very expansive. There are at least like 12 different areas that it connects to in some degree, but these are the main ones that are most heavily represented.
The amygdala is not part of it, is it?
The amygdala, I think, so that has its own connecting network, because there's like about 11 different resting state networks in the brain. So the amygdala has an automatic response network that goes from your lateral prefrontal cortex to the amygdala to your primary visual area. And we're going to talk about that in a second as well. And yes, I wanted to give you all one extra reference that's really excellent, just in case you want to look into more of the brain stuff. There's a researcher by the name of Thomas Froese, and he was one of the writers of that study that I mentioned. The neural coordination can be enhanced by occasional interruption of normal firing patterns. So I'll just write down his website because all of his publications are on there for free, and he is a very excellent researcher. He also talks a lot about like psychedelics and like sort of the origins of consciousness and lots of fun stuff. So that was at oe.wordpress.com, and that is a infinite fountain of wonderful information. Okay, so got the brain stuff out of the way. Is there anything that needs clarification before I move on to how psychedelics interact with that brain stuff?
In regards to flow states, isn't it that the frontal cortex is shutting down somewhat, and how does that relate to psychedelics and how there's a relationship there?
Yeah, so I haven't actually heard that, but that would make sense given that there's less sort of reflective thinking and less sort of higher order cognitive control on your behavior. So the flow state is something that's just going to be sort of general purpose, and it relates to psychedelics insofar as that would be a characteristic of just any flow state at any time.
I guess, guys, I'm trying to marry the two. Like on the one side of things, they found that things are shutting down, and that's where the ego's kind of getting out of the way. But then psychedelics are kind of firing things up. So
well, in different areas, right? So one of the things that psychedelics do in a lot of different places is actually reduce blood flow, and actually selectively increases activity in some areas and decreases activity in the other areas. So it's firing up your higher order cognitive processing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's firing up this network. Actually, it inhibits this network and reduces its dominance on you, which is one of the reasons precisely why you can enter into a flow state more easily, because this isn't as constrained as it usually is. And so it is sort of dampening and shutting down the dominance of that network, allowing you to sort of snap into other areas which are required to functionally respond to the task at hand.
Is that also the case for marijuana?
No, marijuana, I don't think it really has too much of a direct action on the default mode network itself, just insofar as it modulates the dynamics of processing generally, but not specifically in the way that psychedelics do. Yeah.
On the flow state question, it's a long time since I read about this, but I think that I read that the flow state isn't so much the shutting down of the frontal cortex in particular, but it's the shutting down of whatever you don't need for the task. So right. It's an efficiency thing. So because I think you can enter flow states, I think I've been in them, that involve the prefrontal cortex a lot actually. Like if you're like proving math for hours and you're really on a flow or something, and it's, right? In some cases that's authenticity and you're turning it into like symbol processing rather than the really abstract like divergent ego direction kind of thinking. But it's a matter of degree. I think some flow states would be a little more frontal cortex heavy than others because it depends on the task you're flowing at.
That's a very good point. So the point is mentioned that the flow state will be different depending on what you're doing. And yeah, So I should have thought of that, because probably the studies that you might have read had to do with sports, which is much more embodied, right? You don't really need too much of a notion of self. You just need to be like engaged in responding to the external environment as much as possible. But yeah, if you are like, you know, say really getting into like an epic guitar solo or doing a lot of math, then you might require those areas of play.
In sports cases, like they didn't plan beforehand for scrum. That's what the front. We maybe need the coach uses frontal cortex.
Yes. Yeah, the coach, but not so much the player themselves. I saw there was a hand over here somewhere. Yes.
Well, I was just going to add that like those things would almost necessarily need to have like an anterior, very, very conscious state. Like when you're going from a flow state needs to be born of something that is intentional to begin.
Well, yeah.
Right? Like if you're like when you give these examples of like you use this example of the shredding guitar solo. Like you need to have the conscious learning of those processes first.
Yeah.
They're very like muddy first before you can clean them up and put them into a flow state. So
Totally.
it would stand to reason that you have to have some sort of reform frontal cortex.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can't do anything you've never learned to do. Like, it's not like you just
exactly.
randomly get into a flow state and be a virtuoso and do it on a piano, unless you get hit in the head in the right area or something.
Like psychedelics are not going to shortcut you to flow states for things that you don't have a base.
Yeah, of course.
For.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was sort of a given with this, because everything is starting off from sort of that self-referential processing. And yeah, you do need to sort of already find the task meaningful, engaging, and sort of have some practice of the task in general as well. So yeah, when I'm talking about flow states, I'm not talking about any particular flow states, but just flow states in general. So it's just the case that whatever you do that you would like to flow in could come to you easy. And what you mentioned there about the learning process is precisely this sort of shift from needing in the process of learning something to rely on higher order, more deliberate processing and more explicit focus to being able to sort of internalize those processes and being able to do them intuitively and quickly. Anything else, or are we good?
Oh, sorry, one last thing.
Yep.
You already kind of mentioned it, but when you said about math, like it kind of rings a bell for me because I saw something about that recently, just how it activates different parts of the brain, and I thought it was funny that you were showing a graphic. It was like this, because it kind of showed how that with math is that there's a lot of integration of the different parts of the brain, whereas with other kinds of thinking, it's more like the front part of the brain. And yeah, so I do think the prefrontal cortex can be, you know, it's necessary, but kind of can be problematic. So the back stuff there, math seems to need the stuff back there. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually the case for anything sort of higher order and abstract. You have lots of sort of more neocortical activity, and that can more widely integrate than the lower areas of the brain generally.
Dan, brief aside, they say that music is the most global process in the brain, and that's why some people who don't care about music study music cognition anyway. Because they're like, we like global processes, this means we have to study music cognition.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the actual mechanisms of psychedelics and why we can get from those to, say, being more insightful, or having enhanced creativity, or having a more positive mood state, and so on. Okay, so for tryptamine psychedelics, and a lot of them have shown to be very similar, except like I mentioned earlier, in very specific domains are there differences, such as the increased tendency for LSD to stimulate dopamine more directly compared to psilocybin. But those small differences aside, the psychedelic qualities come from the 5-HT2A receptor, and so the 5-HT2A receptor is located most densely along the top of the neocortex. And these receptors are excitatory, meaning that they initiate cascades of activity. They will produce tendencies for greater firing. So they're located, like I said, highly densely across the very top of the neocortex, which is, as you get up the cortical hierarchy, processing gets more holistic and distributed. The cortex itself is distributed into 6 different layers, and then within those 6 layers, you have what are called pyramidal cells that extend all the way up them. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So yeah, you have like the bottoms of a cell down here, which would be right here above where this cingulate cortex is, and they sort of project down into your lower order subcortical tissues to connect that higher order cortex and the lower order organs in the brain, and they sort of extend all the way up here, all the way through these layers. They have lots of like cross connections and so on, but the layers are composed typically of like a giant cell. And at the top of these cells, you have lots of these 5-HT2A receptors, which initiate your top-down processing and allow you to sort of modulate the stuff that's going on below that. Now, the mechanism of 5-HT2A is also paired with the 5-HT1A receptor. And 5-HT1A is inhibitory, meaning it slows down firing, it stops it, inhibits it, and that is located particularly in one area very densely called the RAF nucleus, which is located right on top of your brainstem. So your brainstem is like where your spinal cord starts to project up into your brain, and so it's like about in the center somewhere. And what that does is it actually produces serotonin, and it produces hormones and such, and it sort of extends up in this direction to sort of bathe your brain in serotonin. Another area where you have lots of 5-HT1A receptors is at the bottom of the cells in the prefrontal cortex. So those are the main, but not only, distributions of the 5-HT1A receptor. So we know that the 5-HT2A receptor is responsible for the more psychedelic qualities because researchers have given an antagonist of that receptor and also given people psilocybin, and it completely eliminates the subjective alterations in experience. So there are 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness that are usually measured, which are sort of oceanic boundlessness, feeling of oneness, anxious ego dissolution, visionary restructuralization, auditory alterations, and reduced vigilance. So the 5-HT2A receptor basically eliminates the subjective effects of everything except for reduced vigilance, which is mediated by the 5-HT1A receptor. And so a cool thing that psychedelics are doing is, because this is located in the organ that produces serotonin, and because tryptamine psychedelics stimulate both of these receptors, it's basically replacing serotonin in your brain with that chemical. Because the inhibitory action on the RAF nucleus tells the brain that there is enough serotonin and to stop producing it. And so then you have the 5-HT2A receptor filling in your higher order cortex with that which makes it fire, while also reducing the production of serotonin, and which is creating sort of the thing that is inhibiting the top-down connections and sort of keeping your attention engaged to the external world, which is what the mechanism is happening here at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex. It sort of helps to offset and to govern the relation of your attention from being either directed top-down or from being directed bottom-up by stimuli in the world. So yeah, that's pretty cool. It basically replaces serotonin and shifts processing dominance up to that higher order cortex. That also does that in a number of other very direct ways. So there's been a few fMRI studies which have shown that psychedelics will reduce blood flow to the brain overall. So there's actually usually less what is called perfusion or distribution of liquids and blood to the brain overall. That is particularly a concentrated effect in, say, the thalamus, which is here in the center of the brain, and that routes your sensory information up into your higher cortical integration areas. And it also reduces activity in the temporal lobes, while interestingly selectively upregulating activity in the right frontal cortex and the right anterior cingulate cortex. So it's shifting your activity from being dominated by these lower order things, sort of cooling down the activity in your lower order automatic processing and shifting it up into your prefrontal cortex and your higher order cortex, which is involved in more deliberate processing. So it's basically shifting the dominance of your processing from system 1 to system 2. Now, one of the reasons that that might be useful for insight is because at the right anterior temporal lobe, which is located right about here, there's a burst of activity in that area in insight experiences. So an insight experience is when you have the spontaneous reformulation of a problem after unsuccessfully trying to solve a problem in whatever way you first conceived of that problem. So one of the common examples is called the 9-dot problem. And the problem is that you have to like sort of draw a line through all of those without like taking your pen off the paper or intersecting lines. And usually like you can't really do that because you'll get like stuck in all sorts of ways. So people, because there's a box here, initially conceive of the problem as like requiring sticking in that box, but the solution actually requires like doing some things like this and going down outside of the box in order to, you know, connect them. That's not the exact solution, obviously. But the solution does require thinking outside of the box and going outside of the box. And these studies actually are where we get that phrase, think outside the box. When they were doing these studies in the 80s and 90s on this problem, one of the cues that they gave people was, yeah, here, solve this problem and just think outside the box. That didn't help anybody solve it at all. So what does help people solve the problem, however, is running electric currents across their brain. So there's a thing called transcranial direct stimulation, and you can literally make them with a car battery, and you put electrodes. Don't do that, although it can be done. Obviously, I think it's a little bit better of a standard in the actual research studies. But so then you have different electrodes in the brain, and you can sort of upregulate some areas, make them more likely to fire, downregulate other areas. And so there is a study by Chai and Snyder in 2011. I'll write that name down.
Yes. AC or DC current?
I think I'm pretty sure it's DC.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it should be.
It is
They're actually working on DC current devices.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
There's a guy who shoots him. You want to see me?
Okay, so Chai and Snyder, 2011. So what they did is they put an electrode above the right anterior temporal lobe here and upregulated the activity, and then put one on the left anterior temporal lobe and downregulated the activity. And so what they found is that they could get people's solutions on this 9-dot problem to jump from like 0 to between 90 and 100% of participants solving it. And that is because they are upregulating the area in the brain that we think is responsible for breaking out of your mental set. Your mental set is whatever problem formulation that initially comes to you. And so what is supposed to be the case is that they think that the left anterior temporal lobe is what constrains and keeps that mental set in place. You've probably heard that the left brain usually does more logical processing and the right brain usually does more creative processing, which is kind of true, but what you need is more of an interplay between those. And so what the right brain usually does is initiate a breaking out of the mental set that you have, and then the spontaneous reformulation of a problem occurs thereafter. So by regulating the brain in that way, upregulation of the right anterior temporal lobe, downregulation of the left, you're getting an increased tendency to have that breaking of the mental set and the solution to insight problems. Now, psychedelics are basically a chemical version of that. They're doing exactly the same thing. They are downregulating the left temporal lobe, but upregulating the right prefrontal cortex and the up into the right anterior temporal lobe and part of the cingulate cortex behind there as well. So you're getting precisely the same regulation dynamics that you're getting in that study, and thereby you have an increased likelihood for insight experiences.
Actually, a book I just read recently called Stealing Fire. They named TCDS and psychedelics, but they say the only difference between the two is they name psychedelics as being the most effective.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, it depends on if you want that effect specifically, because psychedelics definitely do more things.
Yeah, they help you get to that effect quicker, and it's much more shown to help you get to that effect at a quicker rate.
Cool. That does not surprise me.
Yeah, I forgot to bring the book for you today, sorry.
Nice. Yeah, that would be definitely something I am interested in.
I'll bring it for you next time.
Thanks. Okay, so let's see. let's talk about the biasing of emotional processing. So there have been papers that have been published on the subject with both psilocybin and LSD. And so what has been found is that there is, like I mentioned earlier, a network going from your amygdala to your primary visual cortex and also to your lateral prefrontal cortex. And when you are shown aversive or terrifying stimuli, there is an automatic burst of activity within that network, which also comes with sort of the feeling of being aversive to that. And what psychedelics do are sort of calm down that network specifically. The amygdala also has a high concentration of 5-HT2A receptors, and so it is supposed to be that mechanism which reduces the activity of that network. When people are shown aversive stimulus and they have just taken either LSD or psilocybin, then you don't get that automatic disposition, that automatic response of that network. So with the LSD, what they were showing people were like fearful faces, terrifying faces. And in the psilocybin experiment, it was a little more gruesome. They were showing people like mutilated bodies and like car accidents and stuff. And yeah, they found that people were not as likely to respond negatively to these things. And what's really cool about that link between the amygdala and the visual cortex as well, the primary visual cortex is like right at the bottom of the cortical hierarchy. And you know, what that like does is sort of direct your vision to sort of seek out stimulus that can fit into the expectation of fear. So if you're like very anxious or something of the sort, then you have a lot of unconscious tendencies that are even directing the orientation of your perceptual mechanisms to sort of account for why you might be feeling anxious or why you might be feeling afraid. And so psychedelics, they calm down that network. They even free up your perceptual experience from undue unconscious influence by learned subpersonal neural patterns, and thereby open it up to learning new ones. Yes? I'm looking at you.
So for the study you just mentioned, did they show the images like, were they like unconsciously shown? Like, so
oh no, it was explicitly shown.
Okay, so they like fully looked at them.
Yeah.
I guess it's just like I'm still kind of baffled by those results. Well, like I'm not surprised about like it lowering people's like reactivity in general, but I guess just like from a whole, my impression was that psychedelics in some way make you more like effectively suggestible.
Oh, actually, that's interesting. It does that if you're high conscientiousness, but not necessarily for others.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, for that, they can, I think I would have to say too much if I got into that.
Okay.
Did I see another hand elsewhere? Yeah.
Do psychedelics, is there any research on like psychedelics and grief?
Sorry, say again?
Psychedelics and grief.
And grief. Oh.
Like, that seems like a kind of a suboptimal state.
No, that's actually precisely probably what you want to be doing if you want to be dealing with those emotions effectively. Because it's going to allow you to take a more broad take of it and sort of to be able to conceive of the relations that might alleviate how much that emotion is affecting you. And because it is sort of biasing your neural substrate away from automatic fear responses and so on, it can actually free up your processing from undue influence by those negative emotions. Because grief is something that's totally natural and that you need to go through. Psychedelics can actually give you the cognitive set that most allows you to effectively integrate those feelings, rather than it being, I don't know, poor for you. Like I said initially, if you do have a negative mood state and you take a microdose and you notice that you are more aware of that mood state, all that means is that you should just set aside some time to reflect on that. If you can't really find a reason for it, then maybe hold off. But I think that the evidence is in favor of psychedelics being able to mitigate negative mood states and to allow you to sort of deal with those things effectively.
So do you see that other substances have an opposite effect? Say like alcohol or marijuana?
Right.
Is that too much?
I mean, marijuana has also been used to like sort of treat depression and anxiety, so it might help as well. Like for post-traumatic stress disorder, it's been very useful, and there's lots of awful emotions going on there. Alcohol, probably not really good for that.
Right, it is a depressant.
It is a depressant, precisely, and it will, even after, like it'll give you temporary relief, but because it's like sort of pushing your brain to produce a whole bunch of things, you will have like sort of a dip in mood after the alcohol is gone from your system, and so you would sort of need to rely on it to feel better. Yeah, it's more like sort of a temporary symptomatic salve. Whereas psychedelics are readjusting your neural processing parameters in a way that allows you to sort of integrate emotions a little more effectively.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify the study you were mentioning where they were comparing LSD to psilocybin in terms of fearful faces.
Yeah, those were different studies.
Okay, so they're different studies, so how were the results different?
In what way?
Or, sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
If there were differences?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't really too much on that, because they are separate studies and they were both like in their own focus area, but they both showed that that mechanism happens with both of them, and that there was a reduced tendency to like sort of feel put off or to feel bad because of being shown bad images.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and so like a lot of your emotions and stuff as well, they are sort of really heavily dominated by your limbic system and by your lower order, more reptilian brain, if you must. And so, yeah, in sort of reducing the dominance of those areas and then shifting you up into other areas, that does allow you to sort of like have a little bit more, you could even say, perspective, which is, if you have like a full psychedelic experience, precisely what you get out of that, which is also manifest in precisely the mechanism of completely shutting down, say, the default mode network and allowing your brain to explore tons of novel connections and novel spaces. So when psychedelics are microdosed, you're getting that, but less. So you're reducing the constraints because of this default mode network on your cognition, allowing you to sort of more easily break into novel states, which is really good if you're trying to get into writing an essay or something and you haven't been able to do that, or even if you need to intervene in a negative mood state. Cool. Let's see. Oh yeah, and one of the other consequences of the shifting up into the higher order neocortex is an increased capacity for broader thinking style, and also because positive mood states generally you can access memories a little bit better. You should be able to get an increased memory recall. Because it's just the positive mood states in general are states wherein you can access a greater range of memories. Yeah, and then so because of being lifted out of the constraints of this network and like sort of the lower order emotional stuff, you can have sort of a broader access to memory as well. And yeah, broader thinking style, because you don't have the same neural constraints that you normally do, so you can have more novelty and, again, more insight experiences, which is all correlated to creativity. Yeah, so for attention, I mentioned that earlier, there's a bit of an interesting relationship between psychedelics and attention. So in this study, which was done in 2005, subjects were given two different tasks to perform. One of them was an attention task, it was a working memory task. The attention task that they gave was a multiple object tracking experiment. And so what that looks like is that you have, again, just a bunch of dots. And they'll highlight like maybe 2 to 6 dots that you have to keep an eye on. And then these will all start to move and spread out across the screen, and then they'll stop them, and then they'll ask you, okay, so which one did we ask you to track? And you'll have to be like, oh, these were the ones that I've been tracking that whole time. Now, psilocybin impaired people's ability to do this, regardless of whether or not the experience was psychedelic. However, it didn't impair their ability to do the working memory task, which was you just have like a screen of rectangles, and then there will be a bunch of rectangles highlighted in a particular order, and you have to recreate the pattern, similar to games that you've all probably played before. That task was fine, but on the multiple object tracking task, participants found that it was more difficult even when they were administered ketanserin, which is the 5-HT2A antagonist that prevents the 5-HT2A receptor action, and thereby sort of eliminates most of the psychedelic and subjective effects. And so I'll just read you a quote from the paper which most effectively sort of summarizes it. So attention consists of 1, the selection of targets, 2, biasing selected targets relative to distractors, and 3, maintenance of the state over time. It may be the case that psilocybin is selectively disrupting only the second stage. One clear prediction based on this speculation is that performance on attentional tasks without distracting components would be unaffected or even enhanced by psilocybin. So what it seems to be happening is that it's actually increasing how your attention is spreading out in the environment. Attention has been shown to have sort of that spreading effect. For example, if you are attending to one object and it's like, well, the tests go like this. I'll just show you the test. So you have, like, say, 2 rectangles with 3 sections. The researchers will highlight this, and then they will get you to respond after highlighting that to the highlighting of one of these other areas. And so what they find is if you highlight this area first, then it takes you a little bit of time to respond here. But if you are directing your attention here first, and they then highlight this area, that there's actually an increased response to the same object responding. So it seems as though attention actually spreads throughout the object. So when you're having too much of the spreading of that attention and an inability to bias your attention towards one over all of the other distractors. What that is also related to is decreased latent inhibition and decreased sensory gating. So what these things are mechanisms in your brain that are preventing you from attending to too much information, because there is effectively infinite information in the environment, and attending to all of it can be, well, very distracting and can impair your ability to sort of hone attention into one thing and focus on it. So that's kind of cool, actually, because it opens up your perception to noticing more things in the environment, so you'll have a bit more of like a rich attentional perceptual experience, which can be good for some things, not good for other things.
Is that all similar to ADHD?
No, I don't think so, because, I mean, at least part of it, but, you know, like I said, that if there weren't distractors, it would actually improve your attention. And so one of the other qualities of attention is maintaining attention over time. And so with ADHD, you would have an impairment in your ability to maintain attention too.
Although you do get hyper-focused states where it goes the other way and there's like extreme.
It's like super manic. Yeah.
It's just sort of, I think it's a misnomer, it's more attention regulation disorders. Mm-hmm. Do you know if the brain processes are also?
I don't know if I could comment on that too much. I mean, insofar as it's attention, and so similar things will be going on. Yes, but yeah, I haven't really looked too much into the actual mechanisms of ADHD, so I don't want to say too much about it.
I think you already did talk about it, moving from system 1 to system 2. Yeah. So it's not paradoxical to say that psychedelics can both improve your ability to see what's around you and have that whole thing happen, but also induce a state of flow. Because if you're having more intentionality between what it is you're moving between, say, system 1 and system 2 broadly, then that's not contradictory to say that they can do both.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see, so what else? Oh yeah, so basically what you can take from this is that if you are microdosing with psilocybin, just reduce the distractors in your environment. Because, you know, you might get sort of really carried away if you were like, I'm really going to work on an essay today, and then you, like, you know, I don't know, pick up an instrument or a video game or something, and you're like, but wow, this is like really amazing. That could be suboptimal. So make sure that you have a schedule and goals throughout the day, and that will basically eliminate the possibility of that being an interfering factor. Yeah, and then so I also mentioned about enhanced ability to connect to others. I think that predominantly has to do with a lot of the stuff about just like sort of freeing up the constraints in your processing and allowing you to sort of more effectively engage and be attentive to an other person. There was also a study that showed that feelings of empathy are increased with psychedelic use, not So they did the study on moral decisions and also on feelings of empathy. So it didn't make any change in people's moral decisions. Say, I'm sure you're familiar with the trolley problems, which are commonly used in these. You are, supposed to be at a track switch. There's a trolley going down a line. The natural path it's going to take is going to kill like 3 people, and if you switch it, then you can rather make it change to a track where there's 1 person tied to it, and you'll kill 1 person instead of 3 people. That's sort of the questions that are used in these experiments. So it didn't really change people's tendency to respond to those, however, it did increase people's sense of empathy as well. So perhaps that could be responsible for your enhanced ability to connect to others. And the last thing, which I've sort of been commenting on throughout this, is that you get sort of a bit of a differentiation, a bit of a novel and more diverse and distributed cognitive style, which can allow you to free yourself from unconscious learned tendencies to respond to the world in certain ways, and open up some room to be able to learn, novel ways of engaging and interacting with the environment, which is precisely one of the mechanisms as to why it's useful for like depression and PTSD and so on, because a lot of that really involves being unduly constrained by learned networks in your brain. And okay, cool. So yeah, that's it for that. Any questions? Yes?
I guess there's no real literature that's formally going to the notion of mutual, but formally has your own opinion. What does these psychoactive substances have to do with the process of mutual?
Right. So the question was, how would psychedelics affect the process of mutual modeling? Now, mutual modeling is basically when you are engaging with another agent, you have a representation of them and what they're like, and they have a representation of you and what you're like. And so that's the mutual model. Each has a model of the other in the interaction space. So I would think that it would reduce the tendency to come to judgments on people based upon endogenously generated impulses, and sort of make you more open to accurately extrapolating implicit information from the environment. You would be able to more effectively make a model of a person, more accurately. Yeah.
There was a word that I caught that you said that I sort of clung to, and it was something like psychedelics either decrease or increase latent inhibition.
Oh yeah, decrease latent inhibition. Latent, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's basically the same thing as like the sensory gating concept, where you have like these unconscious filters dampening stuff in the environment. Yeah, because for example, you could contrast that to the notion of attentional capture. If something really moves in your periphery, then your attention will automatically orient towards it. If you had reduced sensory gating, for example, you might have that effect more, where you're orienting your attention to things that are popping up in your periphery and so on. Yeah, which is why it's useful. Kyle.
What if any are the differences between microdosing mushrooms versus LSD? And is one better than the other for the optimal effects of improved mood or productivity?
Yeah, I mentioned this at the beginning. I think that LSD would be the ideal go-to, predominantly because it has a greater action on the dopamine receptor. So the impairment in a target is related to the 5-HT1A receptor mechanism, because in annihilating the effect of this one, they still have that effect, even though they didn't have any of the other subjective effects. And so I think that with the increased dopamine stimulation, which is involved in like motivation and reward and so on, that you could probably get a bit of a mitigation of that effect, and at least you would feel a little more engaged anyways. Yeah.
But just wondering, so I wonder how psilocybin would affect, let's say, for example, the schizophrenic brain, where a common thing they find is that schizophrenics have trouble with making what's called efferent copies in the brain. So essentially, it's kind of like the brain telling itself what it is doing. So if you throw that into the mix, especially with like how much it doesn't really constrain to that
that is a giant question. I don't think we know enough to be able to say. Yeah, and so in the guide that I sent to everybody, some of the cautions that I mentioned are, if you have a history of psychosis, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, you might want to be cautious about using these things. I don't think that intrinsically anything terrible might happen, but it's just maybe not ideal, and we don't really want to figure that out.
On that point, since these are operating on your 5-HTs, they're doing something similar, in my understanding, to what psychiatrists are trying to do with depressed people's brains, for instance, with SSRIs. And one of the common things that you can get with SSRI treatments and going off of SSRI treatments, or having infrequent SSRI treatments because you go on them for a while, you feel great, you go off them, and then you have this crash. Would you be prone to the similar sort of thing with microdosing LSD or psilocybin?
Now,
in the same way?
I don't think so, especially definitely not for short periods. There's really been no
over long periods. If you do this over several years and then probably stop.
Yeah, I think that the sort of general habituation mechanisms at play would make that the case for any substance over a long period of time, that your brain would just get used to it. So if you're doing it for about a year or so, your brain would become reliant because it would learn that there is the intake of that neurotransmitter is coming into there somehow, and so it offsets the production of it because it doesn't need to produce it, and then so after that you might need to...
And if you cut off the artificial supply.
Yeah, then it needs to renormalize and reproduce again. So yeah, I think that would happen after long periods.
So that would fall under cautions then?
Under which?
That would fall under cautions.
Yeah, that's why I said, at least, microdosing every day for short periods is fine, but if it's getting to around 5 to 7 days, definitely at least take a few days off.
Sorry, you say that a short period in 5 to 7 days?
Yeah, that is my intuition on where would be the most that you would want to microdose in a period for.
So what would be, sorry for the late, I don't know if you covered this, but what would be the optimal environment? I've heard that, it's if you're on vacation, you can do it, but otherwise, go about your daily business,
Yeah, environment's very important. So if you need to get something done, if you have an essay to do, if you have a lot of work to do, if you need to be creative or insightful, if you're engaged in creative products or processes or something of the sort. A lot of people do just sort of microdose to take a day off. I think that's kind of a waste of the experience, right? Because you're sort of tuning up your neural system to be able to solve problems a little bit better. So why wouldn't you solve problems when you're doing that? So I think that, given the information here, you can tell if you need to be more insightful or if you need to sort of more effectively connect to somebody, then you would want to perhaps microdose. For example, there's a family member that you don't really get along with and you're going to see them after a long period of time, maybe microdose and maybe they're really good. Why not?
That sounds like a pretty good pitch for a new drug.
But it'll actually effectively allow you to sort of engage with that person and to, maybe they make you... Well, yeah, not for the best reasons.
Well, yeah. After about 5, they just go short.
But go to work, do what you need to do. If you read Fadiman's book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, what a lot of people are doing is literally just going to work. One of the reports is a person who does movie editing, and she's if I got a really big project, I'll just microdose and then just go really intensely at it for 12 hours and then just finish the project. So yeah, just do whatever you need to do. These are cognitive enhancers, and as such, you should do what needs cognitive enhancing. What you should also be doing is, for example, if you need to quit smoking, or if you need to quit drinking, or if you want to kick a coffee habit, that's also a really ideal time to be using microdosing, because it'll reduce the influence of your unconscious motivational tendencies, which are making you seek that out, and so it can give you the mental fortitude to kick a bad habit.
I understand, if you've got something a task to do, so actually I'm trying to use the microdosing. But what about in situations where you're having to interact with people very closely?
If it's sub-perceptual, nobody will notice it. It's fine.
Nobody will notice. I was at a massage therapist, and I'm should I microdose while I'm at work? So they're seeing stuff. I already get stuff off people, so I'm oh no.
Yeah, it might open up your intuition and responsivity to people.
That's true, yeah.
In that way, but yeah, I mean, like the point is to make it so that you can't even notice it.
Right. Okay.
So I saw a hand that was over here for a while, at the back.
Okay, just to go back a little bit at the beginning, I don't want to wait too much. So you said a psychedelic is not necessarily hallucinogen.
Right.
So, but the opposite, just because I'm thinking of other drugs that have hallucinogen effects. Sorry, my English is not very from Quebec, so sometimes. So I can think, I just seen in the document you referred, there's one about ketamine, for example.
Yes.
Because, so are you going to talk about this eventually, or are you just really going to stick to LSDs? Because I'm just curious if it's the same kind of...
Yeah, it's hard to say. So ketamine is dissociative, and I think that there's something interesting about dissociation in general that sort of gives people strange experiences. For example, people with dissociative identity disorder report a much greater rate of, or a much greater occurrence of possession experiences, feeling taken over by some external entity, and also in having hallucinations and so on.
He has that whole, depending on stories.
Yeah, no, like that definitely gets into there because it just like sort of shoots you off into space, and so I mean you're really not in you at that point as far as your experience goes. But yeah, with ketamine, it becomes more hallucinogenic the more it becomes dissociated. So it's like one of the things that keeps you from hallucinating is a connection between your visual cortex and the thalamus, and so you have like a mutual stream of information where the higher order stream is being coordinated to incoming sensory information, and so in states of dissociation, it literally dissociates certain parts of the brain. And so in that state, you can't really tell what is your own body, let alone what's in the external world. And so your brain is going to start making sense of the extra information in there in like very strange and extravagant ways. Yeah, so I think it's just, yeah, I was just going to end that with saying it's like a consequence of the state of dissociation that you would begin to then sort of extrapolate information in random ways.
So, but you wouldn't call it a psychedelic?
Oh yeah, definitely would call it psychedelic.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's why I wanted to ask, because I wasn't sure if it would be fit in that category.
Oh, yes, I could have answered that much easier then.
Okay.
Yes, psychedelic. Okay, Adam?
Dan, on the question about acid versus mushrooms microdosing, my understanding is that while there isn't a lot of research, acid is a bigger risk for hallucinogen-resisting perception disorder, HPPD.
Right.
That's probably partly because there's LSD mimics, so people are doing, in some cases, probably actually an assortment of drugs.
Yeah.
Does acid. That's probably part of it, but also like we co-evolved mushrooms in a way we do with LSD, and so to me that's like it's a very heuristic level way to assess the risk, but that could be related to the fact that we probably have some mechanisms to resist HPPD from mushrooms that aren't as effective with LSD, because that's not like we didn't co-evolve with a plant that produces LSD, but we did co-evolve long before we were smoking pot because we fired that.
Yeah. Well, LSD is synthesized from ergot, which is a fungus in barley, and so people have theoretically been getting high off of fermenting that.
Yeah, in the witch trials or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Like it gets in your bread and you're just gone.
Right, but it doesn't seem like we wouldn't have cultivated that very effectively.
No, not as readily as psilocybin. So that could be the case. I hadn't really heard that that was a link either. I think probably it does come from the taking of other things as well.
It's probably, and it could also be related to, you mentioned that with LSD there's more dopamine.
Right, exactly.
To me, I think this is probably similar to the hazard of combining psychedelics with stimulants, because if you get super flexible, but then the dopamine makes you confident in your current flexible state, you can like melt and then refreeze.
It just reinforces. It just reinforces.
What reinforces what? Reinforces what? Yeah, whatever flexible state you get into from the psychedelic, then if you add a stimulant to that, then you can sort of freeze you. It's like if you make it a face, you might freeze that way. Well, if you take a stimulant around that, when you're making that face, like, I'm really confident this is the correct facial expression.
Well, yeah, if you want to like have a risk for like recurrent hallucinations, just take a lot of stimulants in a very short period of time. So like that dopaminergic mechanism will itself give you hallucinations generally.
So there's a couple of reasons there why I think maybe mushrooms are safer for microdosing than LSD. I mean, personally, if I were microdosing acid, I would do it for a shorter period of time.
That's fair. That's a reasonable concern, I would say. Yeah, what's up?
You touched on earlier that there was 11 different default resting states within the brain. And I'm just trying to get a clearer understanding around how psychedelics and like magic mushrooms specifically, how that affects that. Like, is it
The reconfiguration of new patterns is definitely going on because it's just loosening up the constraints that those networks give you. Those networks are there specifically so that you don't hallucinate during the day, and that you, are sort of on the same social page as other agents in the waking state. Now, that thing of reformulating networks is definitely going to happen. We don't have too much information on psychedelics effects on these networks in general, and indeed the research on them is still growing in general because, like, for example, fMRI, the resolution of that imaging technique is not really ideal, and so sometimes it's hard to pinpoint like which precise stream in the neural substrate is responsible for one or another signal. Because the images that you get, it's about like a 3 millimeter or 3 centimeter cube or something, so there's like a few neurons that could be responsible for any signal that you get. So there are just like technological problems in sort of differentiating those resting state networks. So the default mode network is really big and it's really easy to study, so we have most of our info on that. But yeah, as far as the other ones, it would just do the loosening of the constraints thing. That's what we could probably say at this point.
And just a follow-up, has anyone kind of made a correlation between 11 dimensions of reality and 11 states of this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. So what they're doing is there's like, you have like one in your visual system, and you have one in your auditory system, and you have one for your sense of self, and so on. So, I mean, actually, what I think is really cool about the 11 dimensions thing specifically is that I was starting to watch a documentary yesterday, and it said that like somebody found out they applied Einstein's like relativity equations, but instead of having 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, they had 4 dimensions of space and 1 of time, and then what they ended up with was just precisely the same mathematical law that describes the electromagnetic field. And so if you want to get into that, you could say that the electromagnetic portion of the brain could perhaps be the traversing of some dimension that isn't precisely the 3 that we operate on.
Awesome. And I'll just add this, as probably the only schizophrenic person in this room, magic mushrooms are freaking great.
Awesome.
They actually help me function and make my craziness make sense. I mean, I just think in tangent.
Cool. Yeah, that's really good to hear. Yeah, my intuitions are that they could be good for such things, but yeah, it's just my ethical imperative that I have to give those cautions. But I'm very glad that you could mention that.
I'm bipolar and prone to psychosis, and I also support mushrooms would help me as well. I do have to be careful about hypomania, but as long as I do that. So.
Great. All right, mushrooms for everybody.
One way that one good way that I think of to deal with avoiding habituation or dependency in microdosing, or kind of getting into any habit in general, is to kind of alternate with alternatives. So I was thinking, I guess, what would you say about kind of maybe doing LSD and then mushrooms?
Yeah, you're still going to get the same habituation effect because they're predominantly working on a lot of the same areas. But like I said at the beginning, what you want is not to be necessarily wanting to using them all the time. It's that you want to time them with your life such that they sort of tune up and make your neural system more efficiently. In general, they should be able to allow you to, create novel connections and to tend your neural networks towards the more optimal attractor states and away from the spurious suboptimal ones that they'll settle into just as a consequence of the probabilities of how things form. So yeah, you definitely want to just do a lot of time off in between, make sure you're timing it in coordination with the flow of your life, and definitely emphasize that it's not something that you want to be doing to be on them for the purpose of just being on them, but you want to try to make it so that you can take something more from that and to sort of tune up your neural machine a little by doing that.
Can you comment on the differences of similarities between, say, psilocybin and like ayahuasca or something?
Right. Yeah. So DMT is just a lot more intense. That's like the main one. It doesn't last as long either. So that's why you usually, in ayahuasca, you have another plant in there that acts as an MAOI inhibitor. MAOI is what will break down DMT in your stomachs that allows it to actually get passed on into your brain. So yeah, the main differences are intensity, required dose, relative duration. And yeah, I think that DMT also usually seems to have a bit more of a tendency to, you don't really have a choice with hallucinations with DMT. It's just going to happen. And often, like, if you need to resolve something, it's usually going to also not be very pleasant. Psilocybin is like much more responsive to you in like what you want to be experiencing, but like other ayahuasca is just going to show up and just like run your face into like mud and blood. Yeah, you don't get a choice, but it's a good place to resolve those issues. Yes.
I have heard of ayahuasca being used to treat addiction, and is that kind of the same logic? Like it kind of disrupts the, habitual functioning. Like, is that like an extreme version of that?
Yep, totally. That's basically how the addiction treatment goes for psychedelics in general. Interferes with the unconscious cyclical motivational and behavioral patterns that result in addiction, while also giving you more perspective on yourself. For example, when you are sort of confronting the hallucinogenic edifice of the ayahuasca experience, you're going to learn a lot about yourself, and it's going to tell you directly what you need to do to change your life. And if you don't do that, then you will suffer as a result. But it gives you good information on how to proceed next, while also giving you sort of the effect of interfering with the unconscious stuff and something else. I think those are the main ones anyways. So, yeah. And sorry, I know you've had your hand up for a while.
Just wondering if you're going to cover it all, like how to actually microdose.
Yeah, I did in the beginning, so you can did you not?
Like, with mushrooms, you do this. With LSD, you do that.
Yes. Yeah, I covered that right at the beginning.
Sorry, I just not heard that.
No problem.
I'll just take a small order to do this. Thank you.
No problem. And for anybody who wants the guides, they are on the Facebook page. So there's just pretty brief instructions. The dosing isn't really as elaborate or interesting as might be thought. So I think you'll find it in there. Thank you. Oh, yes.
So can you go back to that 6 layers of the computer? Why those neurons on the very top don't often get as engaged as the bottom?
Well, because, for example, in the prefrontal cortex, they are mediated by the inhibitory action of 5-HT1A receptors. So where you might have cascades of activity for a top-down attentional direction, those will sort of inhibit that and keep attention mediated by external stimuli and lower order stuff. So you have a lot of like sort of compensatory mechanisms. It doesn't never happen. Like if I form an intention to say something, and or if I want to deliberately think over some logical problem or something, I'm definitely getting the activity of those higher order conceptual things. It's just that in relation to the stuff going on below that, it gets sort of kept in check and can't activate too much relative to where your sort of metabolic resources are being distributed.
Is that why this would be useful for stop quitting smoking? Because I will be able to exercise my control.
Yes.
Any information on crashes off of microdosing?
Yeah, there's really, I haven't heard any reports of that being the case, so I don't think it's too much of a concern, but probably if you get up to around maybe a year of microdosing or something, you could probably expect that.
I mean, actually on a daily basis, because I can find that there's your nootropic quality of it, you can really get into something for a long period of time, but I've totally noticed that there is an energetic crash to it after, depending on.
Yeah, even during the same 6 hours. Even during the same day, you mean, right?
Yeah, same day.
Yeah, totally right. Because
nothing's for free. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No free lunch. The stuff that's happening up here, it is requiring a lot more metabolic energy, which is why your brain tries to offset it to begin with.
It's not that I'm asking if there is a crash. I'm asking if there's any information about the crash.
Well, about the crash that you're speaking of right now, it's just a matter of becoming more tired because you're expending more neural energy. Yeah, meaning you'll also sleep excellently if you like this.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So, yes.
Is there a fundamental difference in kind between microdosing and overdosing and very close dosing?
Yeah, definitely. So it's that thing where there are a bunch of names to refer to psychedelics, and they can become different things in how you use them. So if you're taking a large dose, we're probably getting into hallucinogen and entheogen territory, where it's like you take 4 grams of mushrooms, you don't really have much choice but to apprehend the mind of God. But with smaller doses, that's not really going to happen. and it's more of a nootropic kind of cognitive boosting kind of thing.
When I say fundamental difference in kind, I mean like, so what you described is like just continuing, and then microdosing and normal doses, you're all given that same continuum, but just on different.
Yeah.
My question is, when I say fundamental difference in kind, like that's the spectrum. This continuum does not even begin to describe. Like, it probably is like two different drugs.
No, it never differentiates like that. Yeah, and so what happens, especially very clearly with LSD, is it really sharpens and hones everything in until it warps all of reality in on itself. So, yeah, it is more of a spectrum, and it only becomes different in kind from the explicit psychological experience of it, but it's the same mechanism throughout. Yes?
Just wanted to ask if consuming psilocybin or LSD with food would alter the potency of it when you microdose?
Yeah, at small levels, yeah, to slow down your digestive system. That'll have an effect of that kind on any drug that you take, really. So what it'll mostly do is just sort of slow down how it's being digested, and so you might get more of a smooth come up, and yeah, it might allow it to sort of persist in the stomach long enough to break down a little bit.
Would you say it's best taken in the morning time, usually?
Yeah.
Upon getting up, you're going to take a glass of water, kind of take it, put it in a pill, and just pause it. Do your thing.
Yeah, whatever works for you. I mean, I would definitely suggest doing it in the morning.
What's your personal experience? You've used it before, just curious.
Yeah, morning usually, and also if after say the 5 or 6 hours you're starting to lose your energy and so on, there's also nothing wrong with taking a second dose throughout the day.
5 or 6 hours is usually how long it lasts.
Yeah, psilocybin for a microdose, depending on your metabolism, will last between 3 and 5 hours, say, and LSD will last a little bit longer, usually they're 4 to 6. It's one of the differences of them as well. LSD usually sticks in your system a little bit longer. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have any sort of thing that I do specifically in regards to eating or not eating. It's just, often I'll just nibble a little mushroom on my way out the door or something. That's it. Yes?
The question about the crash. I know at least some people get headaches that they think are from serotonin depletion, and so they try to treat that with 5-HTP to replenish their serotonin. Right. But now my 5-HTP has other things it can do to you, so it's because sometimes 5-HTP will stress you out or give you a headache. So I think I never used it much, and I found it's hard to get the right dose of 5-HTP. But if someone has if they crash afterwards or have fatigue, 5-HTP could be helpful in some cases because sometimes it's serotonin depletion, and so you build more serotonin out of 5-HTP.
I'm not actually sure that would be very accurate in relation to that, because, like I said, it's actually replacing serotonin in your brain with something else, and sort of cooling down the thing that produces it. So you're not getting an overproduction of it, you're actually getting a replacement of the serotonin with something else that's modulating your processing.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe that gives you some of the normal one back if you take 5-HTP then, right? Because if your the serotonin you make out of 5-HTP, I think, is normal serotonin.
Yeah, I mean, it could, but then, because, it's also, so psilocybin is also sort of targeting the organ that's producing the serotonin as well, so it might just bypass that completely, even.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a bigger thing with the ecstasy, the 5-HTP compensating thing, but at least some people I know seem to think that's helpful for them with mushrooms.
Yeah, with MDMA, it definitely is increasing the production of it.
Yeah,
so
there's way huger crash with MDMA for sure.
Yeah, it's actually upregulating the production of it rather than sort of modulating the neural parameters involved in those receptors. It's producing the thing itself. But yeah, everyone's got individual differences and so on, right? So if perhaps based on their own personal neurophysiology, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, on that, just trailer on that one. I don't know the question, but it's also quite possible that it's just traffic. So I think that a lot of these types of things, people are overthinking what's actually going on, and it's just hey, you took some acid and then you didn't drink any water.
Right.
But I wanted to ask. You said you were going to talk about it, but can you comment on phenethylamines and any work that might be in this same realm? Is there any resources that you might have that you can pass on microdosing or cognitive behavioral therapy? I'm thinking about 2CB therapy. And there was grief counseling that was brought up. So I know that there's 2CB therapy, grief counseling, and
Not really, actually. I mean, I've read a little bit of the stuff on like mescaline and so on. There's a difference in the receptor activation. So phenethylamines typically do act more prominently on dopamine and also on a receptor called like indolzamine or something, which I don't know too much about the action of, so I can't really say too much about it.
Do you know any resources that you might be able to pass on, or is there anything that you might know?
Let me think.
Well, Shogun is what I've been saying.
Nothing. Yeah, I can't really recall anything off the top of my head. But there has definitely been.
That's very research, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's. Yeah, you'll just have to look into that. I'm not too sure. Lots of studies have been put out, but like mescaline really hasn't been focused on in the modern research renaissance, and I haven't read any like neuroimaging studies of like the 2C strain and stuff. But I mean, I definitely would think that they would be very useful. One of the first transcendent experiences that I had that helped me with a lot of mental health stuff that I deal with was precisely with 2CC. So
2CC.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those like phenethylamine research chemicals. I can't remember what C stands for anymore. Do you know?
No, it's not even something in the chemical chain. It's their drones. The C is something else. It's not. It's not the chemical structure. It's something else.
Yeah, so they're of the category of phenethylamines, which is the other main category of psychedelics, which also features like mescaline.
2CC, number 2CC?
Yep.
2C. So that's the same chemical compound as in chocolate.
Yeah, I've heard speculations about that.
It's a love mole in front of it.
Yeah. I'm not sure, again, it's a little bit out of my domain. But I know there's another question back here somewhere.
Yes.
Is MDMA something that you microdose similar effect to these, or is
I mean, you could microdose with anything if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend it.
There's been research that shows that microdosing with MDMA affects some neurological changes that you don't want to happen.
Right.
And that doesn't happen even with higher doses of it. I don't know the specifics, but it's specifically counterindicated.
Okay, so this guy says absolutely not.
Yeah, there's a woman who's currently doing PTSD clinical trials with MDMA at Ryerson University. So she's doing it with like with couples, and like one person decided to suffer from PTSD, so they're treating them both with MDMA. And she highly recommended that you do not microdose with MDMA. Apparently, it causes like insane amounts of anxiety and it's really unstable.
Do you have a name though for MDMA PTSD therapy?
Actually, she's going to be doing a talk at the Mapping the Mind for Mushrooms conference in September in San Diego. So she's going to be talking about that.
Yeah, that's her name. Her name is Anne Wagner. But, yes, go ahead.
So, I forgot my question.
Oh no!
And, so I wanted to connect, I wanted to get your sense of how do you connect things, because when I hear you talk, I connected this to other more like classic people, you know, when you have an insight, like you were saying, when you spontaneously break the frame, all the symbols there are electric. You know, the whole light bulb thing, then getting struck by lightning, there's always something like that. You said that literally the running current over your brain was going to help you with that.
Right.
The other stories are also about that all of a sudden you're always been fearing this bear, you're always been fearing some kind of strong force in your life, and there's always this meeting which at some point you look back at it and you're like, I don't fear you anymore, I actually don't care about you that much. Which is the thing that you were saying with the faces. And there's also this prevailing idea, don't take yourself so seriously, humble yourself before God, all that stuff. Or also this notion that if you are going to change the world, you have to change yourself first, and therefore change within you before you try to change the world. Which is why I think it makes sense that California, which is a culture so much about trying to make a dent in the universe, would be the one that's so receptive to microdosing.
Right.
And in me particular, what it inspired me was for Kabbalah, for Jewish mysticism. There's this notion that you have to leap from the tree of knowledge to the tree of life. And that is to say that it may be the case that the tree of knowledge is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's your knowledge of the world and things that are good and bad. But the notion in Kabbalah is that stick in there and you live there, you're gonna be miserable. So you sort of have to live like the monkey that goes from one tree to the next, to the actual life, and to sort of like talk and do something in the world.
Yeah.
So that you don't live in your position.
Yeah, so you need like cognitive flexibility in order to like jump into whatever is the most optimal thing to be in.
Yeah, so does it cause you the same? Does it make you think of some stories, some myths, some...
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think that like if we're going to get into like Jewish mysticism and stuff, that this just literally does precisely what Jewish mysticism says that happens in like visionary experiences. For example, they break down the soul into a bunch of faculties, the main cognitive ones being the rational faculty and the imaginative faculty, and the experience of prophetic vision is supposed to be an overflow of the rational faculty into the imaginative faculty. The imaginative faculty takes in impressions from the environment and retains them, and then it's also what is active in dreams. You get the recombination of impressions that you've taken from the external world by your imagination, and when you're having a prophetic vision, then that is when your rational faculty is giving your imaginative faculty higher order abstract concepts that you didn't otherwise have access to, and it's reformulating your imagination in relation to that overflow of the rational faculty in the imaginative faculty. And that basically is like, so the rational faculty is system 2, the imaginative faculty is system 1, and it upregulates your system 2 stuff and bumps you up into the rational faculty, which makes sense of not only these interactions, but also of the greater psychedelic experience when you do have visions.
That was really profound.
Yeah, thanks.
That was awesome.
Deep. Yeah, that's the stuff that I really like a lot.
Overflow the other direction. Because
Delusion and insanity.
Well, it makes me to get that way too. It's surprising because I thought you were going to say the opposite. I thought you were going to say that the imaginative faculty overflows into the rational faculty.
Correct. Yeah, so the imaginative faculty just basically is what fills up your mind with content, and then the rational faculty is like the operations upon content. And then so if you have too much of the content interfering with the rational faculty, then it's going to interfere with the rational faculty.
Because I would think it more weakens the boundary between the two, not that there's necessarily that one is going towards the other.
Yeah, there's like a mutual overflow, each informs the other, but when you get intelligible messages from a vision, then that is more due to the activity of your rational faculty. Yeah, if it's unintelligible, then it's more dominant in the imaginative, but the more intelligible it gets.
By the way, if you ever heard in connection to that, something my mother, who used to do a lot of drugs, told me about, was that she would get this like single word or a couple of words that appear in her mind. And it wasn't until I was older and took more drugs that I got this same experience. But it sounds like what you're describing, actually, the rational faculty. Like you're saying, if there's an intelligible message, that probably comes from the rational faculty kind of thing, and then but it's expressed in an imaginative way.
Yep.
Is that the idea?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Totally. And then, yeah, you can definitely get it just being like ideas get directly transmitted to you. That was the level of prophecy reserved to Moses, who just got like spontaneous insight beamed into his mind by God, and it was just clear and articulate.
Right. Maybe thought is a bit more because I get a lot of like hard to verbalize insights from cannabis. That's like that could be the other way around.
Yeah, it could be. I think it definitely makes you more enmeshed in your imagination. So we're going to probably wrap it up quickly because we don't have too much time left. One last thing that I wanted to mention for everybody is that we are having a conference about psychedelic mushrooms on September 23rd. So that'll be starting around 8 a.m. It's a yoga session, and then the conference starts at 9. We're going to be raising funds for psychedelic therapy. So if you want to hear some amazing talks by a bunch of eminent researchers. We even have one of the researchers from Johns Hopkins University who's been doing the psilocybin research himself.
Dennis McKenna?
That's afterwards. So we're also doing this in partner with the Toronto Psychedelic Society. So they have Dennis McKenna speaking at an event after that, and then we're going to have an after party for more fundraising fun. And so there's a pretty big day full of psychedelic related things that you can do. So it's September 23rd.
I'll be microdosing at the after party.
Yeah, microdosing.
Yeah, you're right.
So yeah, like 5 minutes, maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Anybody want to get anything else in?
Where are the shrooms?
Where are the shrooms? Unfortunately, naturally, not too much in Ontario. But if you go to BC.
That's the plan, that's the plan.
Yeah. Lately, I read in the same book about a gentleman, I forget his name, who wrote a manual called P, small I, K-H-O-L.
Shulgin.
Yes, that's his name. He's doing a lot of academic work on what he did, because he's mentioned as an expert.
Yeah, well, he synthesized or like rediscovered MDMA, so that's like an area where there is work based on what he's done. And a lot of like the research chemicals, like the 2C series and other things, have been synthesized by him as well. So they are in the cultural milieu in many ways. Some of them have been rigorously scientifically studied, others are just like on the market. Yeah.
So would you recommend reading that manual or getting more insight? Or
I've never read it, so I wouldn't say it's necessary to understand, but if it's something that you want to partake of, especially to sort of get into contact with like the psychedelic culture, then it's probably a good read.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a lot of academic work on that particular thing.
Not the manual. Yeah, just the stuff.
Yeah, I just have two questions. I guess in terms of environment, is there any specific environments that are more enhanced towards the psychedelic experience in general? I know it probably varies depending on as that research or investigated.
Environments that you want to be in are the best ones to be in.
So it is basically.
Yeah, it's like, so set and setting is the common advice for stress-free environment. Now, if you're talking about microdosing, just, you know, whatever's sort of aesthetically nice and keeps you working well. But if you're going to larger doses, then you also sort of want to structure the environment with like things that are significant to you. Say, you know, if you have like a painting that's inspiring, or like some like statue of a Buddha or something, then you know, sort of bring those things around the environment. They'll cascade insights for you. You'll be able to extrapolate a lot more information from objects in the world in that state. So filling it with as much meaning as you possibly can is usually pretty good.
And have you heard of